what does that do for your understanding of the literal nature of Genesis 1?
And if that's incorrect, then I would have to quite literally rethink my entire understanding of Genesis. For me, I'm just thinking as a Bible believing Christian. If I'm to believe that this is literally true, I would have to say, because Moses came after all of this, right? So the only way he could know.
It's a full-time job. The apologists have a full-time job taking what we are learning about the world and trying to fit the Bible into it.
When in these kinds of conversations between you and I feel a bit like a fish out of water. You know, like philosophy.
Philosophy's your world.
Yeah.
Well, here's why I appreciate you, because what I found when I went to study apologetics was I had to study a lot of philosophy just to do apologetics. People say, why don't you talk to somebody who's more theologically, tapped in? And I'm like, I think this is a much more natural discussion because you don't have some of the preconditioning that I was getting when I went to school. They were trying to precondition me, like, here's how you get out of this hole. Here's how you get out of this judo move.
Oh, I see.
And I'm like, I don't want to do all that. I want to just naturally.
Your interpretation of the dome, and then from there, like, we went into my theory as to what firmament meant and all that. How does that work, you think, going forward?
Yeah, that was cool. I liked it.
I thought it worked really well too. I was thinking about that, so I don't know if maybe you want to go for that.
Sure. Well, like last time, when we started last time, you were able to you had some time to think about the previous session, and you kind of wanted to clear up a few things. I actually have done the same thing. Like after we got off, I said, well, let me think about that a little bit more. I'd like to actually dive back in on your idea of the heavens and then go right from that to issue number 3.
Okay. In particular, what did you have in mind?
So there's some things that I said that I'm like, I thought about it when we got off, and I was like, man, I need to think harder about that, because I kind of said while we were on, like, I could be wrong, because I had a feeling like I think I'm wrong here. But when I said, when I was saying you don't really see God in heaven in the Old Testament, I was actually able to think of a few passages. Was like, well, you can get the impression that he's in heaven from these passages, and in particular, Deuteronomy 4:36. This is Moses talking to the people, and he says, out of heaven, he, meaning God, let you hear his voice. So just when you think about that out of heaven, there's a number of ways you can take that. You can take that as, remember, the word for heaven is sky, right? It could just be saying from above, like you heard a voice from above. And it was a, ancient conception of God, that God is above, God is up. So this could just be a way of saying God spoke from above. You heard a voice, or it could be saying God's in heaven here. Right after that, Deuteronomy 14, he says, know therefore today, Deuteronomy 4:39. Deuteronomy 4:39. He says, know therefore today and lay it to your heart that the Lord is God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. And you see that a lot of times in Deuteronomy. You see this in heaven above and on earth below. It could just be a way of saying in all of existence, as high up as you can go and as low down as you can go. Or it could be saying God is actually in heaven. So just another way to look at this idea of in heaven. But Deuteronomy 26:15, it's a famous passage. And this is a prayer we're saying to God, look down from your holy habitation from heaven. So right there, you kind of get this idea of heaven is God's habitation. So that could lend, credence to your view that you have the sky that we look up and see as heaven, but then you have this other idea, heaven of heavens, where it's God's holy habitation.
If I'm to Um, yeah, I guess what I was going to say is, yeah, taking the view that I upheld last time,
Hmm.
where I said, yeah, St. Paul says there's at least three.
Hmm.
I was, yeah, I was aiming for that. That was the
Hmm.
first one. So would you say then that but how does it, I guess, how does it affect your view? Because you have, I kind of remember your layering, I
Hmm.
guess, of the heavens. Um, so you would say like above the windows is another heaven.
Yeah, and actually, there might be some biblical proof for that. I actually just lost the verse. I'm going to try to find it again real quick. Hold on.
Yeah, no
It's
problem.
actually the verse that you had us looking at last time when we were dealing with the issue of light, if I'm not mistaken. Remember that Exodus 24:10?
Oh, yes. Is
Yeah,
that when they're eating?
yeah. So
Okay.
check this out. And the interesting thing here is this simply a comparison or is this an ancient cosmology? Because it says Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. Now think about this. They're looking up. Well,
Hmm.
first of all, they're going up into the mountain. And in the
Hmm.
ancient cosmology, the mountains were almost like the pillars holding up the sky. Sometimes you see this. The mountains are pillars holding up the sky. But they go up into
Okay.
the mountain, and when they're up in the mountains, guess what they're close to? In their cosmology, they're close to the heavens, the sky. But so think
Okay.
about that. It says they went up and they saw the God of Israel. Now think about this, almost like a glass ceiling. Under God's feet, here, verse 10, there was something like a pavement made of sapphire, clear like the sky itself. Some versions say as clear as the sky or as clear as the heavens, right?
Yeah.
So here you have this idea that they're going up and they're looking up, but it's not like they can actually get to God because they're all they can see is the glass ceiling under God's feet, this clear pavement like sapphire, and it's compared to the sky. So this is just an ancient cosmology of there's something between, no matter how high up you go, there's going to be something between you and where God is. And it's this
Mm.
clear pavement under his feet, but over our head.
Yeah. So in your, when you talk about your cosmological view,
Mhm.
you have the firmament. So you're, in your view, would have to be, do you think that's referring to the firmament itself?
Yeah. Yeah. I think Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:8 is referring to the same heaven.
Okay,
Yeah.
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 Yeah, I remember when you mentioned that. Okay.
Yeah. And so I think this verse here from Exodus, I think it sort of paints that same picture, even though I can see where you would get what you're saying from, because I think as their understanding or their conception of heaven grows, you start seeing more activity in this place that they're calling heaven. And that's obviously not the dome. So there must be something else happening. But it seems like even from a passage like this, the dome just kind of gives them a there's a view beyond the dome that gets you into a deeper kind of heaven. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Yeah.
And so would that, how would that affect though your reading of Genesis 1:1? Would you say that that could potentially be that second heaven?
I would say,
Or
yeah, the a deeper heaven, because we don't get the idea of second and third heavens until the New Testament. Heaven of heavens might get you closer there, but I think it's just like more heavenly space. But somewhere in their conception, it's not just, especially in Genesis 1, it's not just you go up in the mountains, you reach the sky, and then God's right beyond that. There's a body of water between the sky and where God is. So I have to factor that in. That beyond this dome separates waters from waters, waters beneath
right.
the dome from waters above it.
Exactly. Yeah. So I remember I mentioned that to you because
Hmm.
I interpreted firmament as space,
Right.
and so I said at the outer reaches of space there has to
Right.
be some sort of, if it's to be taken literal, some
Right.
sort of cosmic ice or something,
Yeah.
because I don't think there is a, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think there is a word for ice in
I don't
Hebrew.
know.
I might be wrong because I
But
don't know about that either.
even
I
if there
believe it
were
would still
though,
be water. Yeah, sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, but I guess like I said last time, the issue with that would be finding enough of it to create something like a dome over all of space. But then also for their worldview, you go high enough up into the mountains and you're close to this. Like that's what the whole ziggurats were, right? Oh, well, not the ziggurats, but the Tower of Babel, right? You're building these towers to get high enough to actually reach the heavens. So
Mhm.
whether it be the mountains or these ziggurats or these towers, they literally believe that if you go high enough, what you're doing is you're not in space, you're right at the bottom of heaven. There's this glass ceiling over us and where heaven is. So it's we'd have to pour in what we know about space to what they thought they saw, and it's to me it's two different cognitive worlds.
I believe I had us read briefly. I think it was Deuteronomy 10:14. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
where it says, "Behold, the heaven and the heaven of heavens
Mm-hmm.
is the Lord's thy God, the earth also with all that therein is." And when I read that and I think to myself, the heaven and the heaven of heavens, every time I see that line, it's just, to me, there's
Yeah.
a clear distinction. Like, there's a clear distinction between, there's something called heaven and there's something called the heaven of heavens, to which I always think to myself, um what is the
Right.
heaven of heavens? Because I don't know what
Yeah,
that could
yeah. Well,
mean.
remember what I said to you before, right? Normally, when you see Christians get into debates, it's about somebody wanting to take something literally that someone else wants to take figuratively.
Yeah.
And I think the scholars of Hebrew would say the heaven of heavens is really just a flowery, poetic, figurative way to say as high up as you go. So don't just think about heaven as in terms of the dome, as high up
Mhm.
as you can go into that dome, God is still there. Where can I go from your presence? If I go to the deep, you're there. If I go into the heavens, you're there. It's this idea of the language is not necessarily literally trying to say there's heaven and then there's heaven of heavens. It's just trying to, like, Hebrew has a lot of parallelism and a lot of, it exaggerates things to just say, I'm saying the same thing I said the first time. I'm just saying it in a more elaborate way so that there's no way for you to get around what I'm saying. And that could
Mm.
be what you're dealing with when you see heaven and heaven of heavens. Because they don't talk about a heaven of heavens, you kind of would have to press their language to make them be inventing or speaking of some new or different category. They're probably just talking about heaven in a very poetic or figurative way.
Okay, interesting that you say that. If we go to, if you can quickly turn your, I believe you're on an e-reader,
Yeah.
Psalm 115,
Mm-hmm.
because there's another passage that seems to, at least seems to, make a distinction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I don't think we read from this. I think we read from Psalm 148 last time, but it's Psalm 115, verse 16.
Mm-hmm. Well, even before we get that far, here goes
Yeah.
a passage in verse 3. Our God is in heaven. He does whatever he pleases. So they put God in heaven and not in a heaven of heaven. So that's why I was saying their concept of what's happening in heaven seems to grow from early on, where heaven is just this dome, to now you have people acting in heaven, and now you have, you know, and
I
God
see.
is
So,
in heaven.
so you would attribute it to our thought has developed, in like our thought has developed now, and we have a more sophisticated, let's say, understanding of.
Yes and no, because like I said, you still have, even in Genesis chapter 1, Elohim, which I take as a plural. I think the original Genesis passage was a plurality of gods, not just God. Elohim
Okay.
is God's plural.
Yeah.
And the gods say, let us make man in our image. And so it could be argued that the gods are doing this activity in heaven, but not necessarily in the dome of heaven, but beyond the dome. And it's still being referred to as heaven, even though they're not said to be in heaven. You have to ask yourself, well, where are the gods when they're saying, let us make, or where is God when he's saying, let us make man in our image? Where is this happening at? And I would think in their conception, even if they said it's happening in heaven, they wouldn't mean it's happening in the dome. They would mean it's happening beyond the dome. But just referring to that whole region as anything up is heaven.
In Hebrew, if I'm not mistaken, the word for heaven is shamayim, right?
Mm-hmm.
Shamayim. That I'm ending
Mm-hmm.
signifies.
Plurality.
Is it plural?
Right. But the plurality is
Is,
not
is,
necessarily
is,
in plural in number. It could be what they call a plural of majesty, because something is so grand or so great, it ends up getting the plural. It's almost like the joke when somebody says, "You ain't got a forehead, you got a five head," right? Or somebody because something is so grand, you give it a plural. You give it the credit for being plural, even though you're referring to just the sky. But you say a pilot flies the friendly skies, plural. It's one sky, but it's so grand that you pluralize it. That's the word. That's kind of how Shemayim is.
I guess you know what it really comes down to, I guess, the way you or the way anybody interprets that opening verse.
Yeah.
Is this referring to, because I see what you said last time where
Mm.
you talk about this reads to me like it's referring to something that we are going to detail. And I see that in, for example, and we'll get into it
Yeah.
in a second when we talk about Genesis 2, because in Genesis 2, chapter 4, it says, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. And then Genesis 5:1, this is the book of the generations of Adam. And then in Genesis 9, it says, these are the generations of the son of Noah, Shem,
Mm-hmm.
Ham. So it's giving that language of let's detail
Right.
what has happened,
Mm.
um, or the genealogy of such and such people.
Mm.
So that in the beginning, I think it's, to me, since it's lacking that, I guess that these, if, for example, I know that in Hebrew, and when I studied Hebrew, I got to translate Genesis 1 for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was a couple ways you could translate it. It was,
Yeah.
the classic in the beginning God created, but there's also the in the beginning of God's creating.
And some
If I'm not
versions
mistaken.
actually read that way. We'll get into that when we talk about chapter 8. We're going to actually dive into that
Okay,
of my
yeah, then
book.
I don't
Yeah.
want to get into it yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, to me, I guess I would have to accepting, and again, this is
Mm.
going to come from my own bias, accepting Paul's distinction
Mm.
of the different heavens.
Gotcha.
I would have to, go back and read Genesis, because of course, you know, and I can already see, people might criticize me and say, well, he's taking the New Testament
Mm.
understanding and he's going back and interpreting it in light of what St. Paul said or what Jesus said.
Mm.
And that's fine, because uh that's how the
Right.
apostles did a lot of their
Right.
theology for the most part. So I guess following that same line of thinking, I would have to look at what St. Paul says and say to myself, okay, he's clearly saying there's more than one heaven. Where can we
Mm-hmm.
find that in Genesis?
Mm-hmm.
That is what gives me my impetus to
Yeah.
interpret verse 1.
I,
So,
I respect that. I respect
yeah.
that. But aside from until you spend some more time to think about, one of the most these recent scientific discoveries of potentially being this water being sort of somewhere in the outer atmosphere, so as far back before other elements begin to form, or whatever that finding is. Until you can flesh that out more fully, what does the idea of the dome, the canopy, the vault, what does that do for your understanding of the literal nature of Genesis 1?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I thought about that. I don't think you see, the thing is, I don't even think you can make a literal interpretation in the 21st century
Mm,
of Genesis without having some sort of like ice crystals.
right.
Just because, following the logic, if on the fourth day God puts the lights in the firmament, now we know now through
Mm,
scientific discovery that that's space. That has to be
mm,
referring to space. So when I go back to Genesis 1:7 and 1:8, where God makes the firmament, calls it heaven, I have no choice to interpret that heaven as space.
mm,
So given that there's water separating it,
mm.
there's really no other logical step
Okay.
than to say there's got to be some sort of ice.
Mm.
And if that's incorrect, then I would have to quite literally rethink my entire understanding of Genesis.
Two
I
questions
would.
follow. Two questions
Sure.
follow from me. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Um, what do you think they thought it meant when they received this text originally?
Okay. Yeah. So that depends on who you believe to be writing,
Right. I mean, even
right?
if
Who you
Moses,
believe to be
even if I
writing.
grant, I don't believe it, but even if I granted that Moses wrote it for the people exiting Egypt,
Hmm.
who did they, or what did they think it meant when it says God created a dome to separate waters above from the waters below? What do you think they thought that meant?
Let me give you the answer. I'll give you a straightforward answer.
Mm,
When we're talking about how can I say this? If for me, I'm just thinking as a Bible believing Christian,
mm,
if I'm to believe that this is literally true, I would have to say, because Moses came after all of this, right? So the only way he could know about all this stuff going down way before his time
mhm.
is if it's supernatural revelation.
Right.
That's
Right.
got to be the only, thinking about it logically, because if it's not supernatural revelation, then I have to fall back on this was their understanding
Mhm,
of how this all came to be.
mhm,
If so, those are the two ways you can go about it. I can't think of a third. So if I'm to say, you know, there was some sort of supernatural revelation,
mhm,
one could ask the questions of when did it happen, because it doesn't specify anywhere from Genesis to Deuteronomy um where Moses had the time to write down the first five books. I think one could make a case where, he's on the mount 40 days at a time. He's not eating, he's not
mhm,
drinking water, because it does say that about Moses, right? That he
mhm,
went without food and water for 40 days. One could maybe make the claim that if Moses supernaturally received Genesis and God gave him this revelation of this is how it went down, and maybe you could even say Moses's original documents or whatever were lost, and this was them writing down what Moses had said, because a lot of history is like that.
mhm.
Most of it is like that. Um, then then that would be the way to go. And then at that point you could say, well, this was supernaturally revealed to Moses. If I go the second route and I say, this was Moses and the ancient Hebrews who had come out of Egypt and their descendants. This is how they interpreted the beginning of time up until the Exodus. Then at that point, yeah, I would have to fall on how it was that
Mm,
the ancient Hebrews understood their cosmology. And I
mm,
would have to then do exactly what you're doing right now, which is to say, let me see how the ancient Hebrews understood their cosmology. And I would have to go with that interpretation.
okay.
But ultimately, to tell you the truth, I would have to say that they were wrong.
Mm,
I wouldn't be able to have the luxury of saying, well, here's this outmoded cosmology, and this was their understanding of it, but somehow it's still right. I
mm,
would find that a bit, I think I would fall into the trap that you basically say, a lot of people who are trying to hold on to Genesis 1 and 2 are doing, which is saying, yeah, you know what? This cosmology is outdated, but spiritually, somehow we can still make sense of it or say that it is truth, just not necessarily the way it actually happened.
It
So I'm,
contains truths, even if it's not truth itself.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, exactly.
Okay.
So does that answer the
Yeah, it
question?
definitely does. It definitely does.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to get into the other question was going to be, which you don't even need to entertain if you don't want to. I mean, we know now that, you know, the Earth and our planetary system and all that is the result of, you know, suns and, you know, other stars, you know, exploding and, you know, things coalescing after cooling down. And the stars don't come after the Earth. The Earth came after stars. Everything that's in our world, everything that's in us is the product of an exploding star somewhere.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, this definitely goes beyond my level of,
Right.
of
Mine too.
understanding.
I'm just
Okay,
taking what, you know, what astronomers say about how our world came to be.
I know that there's a guy, and again, because I know very little about this. This is goes beyond my level of understanding. But I think there's Hugh Ross, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know Hugh Ross believes that Genesis is a genuine account of the creation. I would be curious to see what he says, just because
Yeah.
I mean he studied all that. I would have to maybe rely
Yeah.
on whatever he says because I don't really
Yeah.
know.
It's a full-time job. The apologists have a full-time job taking what we are learning about the world and trying to fit the Bible into it. That's the creationists. The other apologists have another full-time job of saying, okay, we're not going to try to fit the Bible into our current understanding. We're going to try to find out what they understood at that time and see maybe how they were just writing polemically, how they were just using common tropes and then not sneaking, but injecting it with right theology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I tell you? I was recently, and this is just on a side note, kind of, but still relevant. I was messaging this person on LinkedIn. They're like, "Hey, I was looking at your conversations between you and Brady, and et cetera, et cetera." He's like, "I want to go into either apologetics or philosophy," and I said, to be honest, those are similar, but they're also very separate. Because when in these kinds of conversations between you and I feel a bit like a fish out of water. Like philosophy, I
Philosophy is
feel,
your world.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
so much different. But at the same time, I think the one similarity is the necessity to have a logical structure. And
Yeah.
that's why I really appreciate your book, because you're consistent. And I've told people that. I've said, Brady's consistent in his book where he says, look, if St. Paul is saying that this literally happened, we have to come up with a literal interpretation of this. And if we can't do it, then we got to give up the whole thing. I think William Lane Craig, you quote William Lane Craig in the book. And so that's one thing where I say, yeah, Brady's right on that. I mean, if we're going to be consistent, we got to be consistent.
Well, here's why I appreciate you, because what I found when I went to study apologetics was I had to study a lot of philosophy just to do apologetics. And when I realized the connection between the two, I like having this discussion with you. Like, people say, why don't you talk to somebody who's more theologically, you know, tapped in? And I'm like, I think this is a much more natural discussion because you don't have some of the preconditioning that I was getting when I went to school. They were trying to precondition me, like, here's how you get out of this hole. Here's how you get out of this judo move.
Oh, I see.
And I'm like, I don't want to do all that. I want to just naturally come to the text without all of these, these special moves that you have to do to make it work philosophically. I would like to just say, well, does this work philosophically without, without the tricks? I'll have the discussions with the apologists. I think I will have those, but I always get frustrated because they pull out things like presuppositional apologetics and different things that to me just don't really seem organic And I think this discussion is more organic. That's why I appreciate this.
Yeah, it actually that ties into what I said um in the maybe in the previous episode, where
Mm,
I say that my whole my whole theory of knowledge going forward is just a coherence theory, showing
mm,
that, you know, from start to finish, from Genesis to Revelation, there's at least a coherence. I'm not
mm.
pulling anything out of thin air or saying
Yeah,
like
yeah,
quoting St. Augustine or something. It's just diving into the text
yeah,
and taking it at face value,
yeah.
because that's really what everybody else in history had to do.
So do you, and when you say coherence, is it coherence only within the text, or do you also rope in to your theory of knowledge a correspondence theory? Like how much do you rely on that as well?
Yeah, I think correspondence, in my opinion, correspondence is king.
Okay,
I think
got you.
coherence, yeah, coherence helps make sense of an
Hmm.
idea, but it
Hmm.
doesn't prove that it's true.
Got you.
And I gave that example of
Yep. Yep.
remember the Nazi Soviet
Hmm.
example? Yeah.
Hmm.
So I mean, you can have a coherent understanding of what the Soviets are doing, but
Yeah.
they might be deceiving you. And
So
that's one
so
thing.
mm,
Yeah,
I feel
sorry.
you. Yeah. No, I'm just thinking that just saying that what you're seeing me do in this book is I'm actually addressing the Bible on both of those. I'm
Hmm.
trying to show
Yep.
I don't think it corresponds to reality. And when we get in the more theological chapters, I'm going to demonstrate I don't think it's even coherent. I don't think what Paul says about Genesis is what Genesis says about Genesis. But I do think you'll have a strong leg to stand on with the progressive revelation, making it cohere more than I would say it does. But I think we'll have a good discussion about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
Um. Okay. So what say? Should we go into
Yep. Issue number 3.
issue number 3? Yes. This one, if I can just give my take. I think when I was, and this is going back to my biography that I gave you a while back, but I think one of the issues I had when I was starting to think that the Bible was bunk
Mm,
was, how is it that people have never noticed,
mm,
Genesis 1 and 2 just seem
mm,
different. I mean, to me at the time, I said to myself, nah, these are just different creation accounts.
mm,
Um, but I have, in trying to hold together the view which is under attack, I have tried to break down each thing line by line. But I think maybe a good place to start would be with your view,
mm-hmm.
and maybe just going into um, where my view kind
Yeah.
of
Cool.
differs. Uh,
So
yeah.
you want
So
me
do
to?
you, yeah, it's up to you. You can maybe give a
Yeah.
brief. I have some notes. Maybe
Okay.
if maybe to clarify some things going forward, but for the most part, you can go ahead and
Yeah. So I'll read the first paragraph and then give a summary.
yeah.
First paragraph of this issue number 3. We're still in chapter 3 for those who are reviewing. Chapter 3, I talk about 3 issues uh, that are problems with taking Genesis chapters 1 and 2 literally. Not that it's not true, just taking it literally. These are the problems. And the biggest issue, we get at issue number 3. Um, Says the final and most challenging problem facing early Genesis that we will address in this chapter is the contradictory, irreconcilable accounts of creation. If this challenge stands, how then can we take the text literally without the competing narratives canceling one another out? Either one passage or both are not telling the literal truth. And if one or both are figurative, or worse, fictional, we might be well within our rights to question if we are being told the truth at all, if we are dealing with the unquestionable word of God or the questionable words of men. And so I look at these 2 creation accounts, and some of this, it was the first time it stood out for me when I was doing this study. The order of creation is different in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. So I have a chart here that just shows in chapter 1, first it's land, then plant life, then animals, and man and woman. Man and woman are made on the 6th day. In chapter
Mhm.
2, it's the land already exists. It's not even created. It just exists. Then man is second. Then plant life is third. Animals are fourth. And then the woman is made fifth. In between the man and the woman, you have plant life and animals being made. That's just different than what you see in chapter. What really stood out to me when in this study was it's not just the order of creation that's different. It's the reasons why things are created that are different.
Okay.
In chapter 1, man is made to subdue the earth and rule the earth. In chapter 2, there seems to be this problem-solving nature to why things are being created. There's no plant life because there's no man. Okay, so let's make a man. We solve that problem. Man's alone. Okay, so let's make animals to solve that problem. And then they don't solve it. Okay, then let's make women. Let's make women. The reason why things are made in chapter 2, it nails you to the order, because if this is created for a particular reason, you can't violate that order. Which is interesting because you would think between the two chapters, you would think chapter 1 is the more fixed order that you can't change, because it says the first day, second day, third day, fourth day. Mm-hmm. But then when you get to chapter 2 and you see the reasons why things are made, you're like, well, wait, if this was made for this reason, then it can't have come before it because it was made after it to solve that issue. So both chapters seem to have inviolable orders that disagree, which is why a lot of theologians, when they have to try to figure out, okay, they can't both be literally true, they actually go back and they change the order of chapter 1. Even though it says first day, second day, third day, fourth, they look and say, well, dag, chapter 2 has reasons why things are created. We can't change that order. So they go back and they say, oh, well, then maybe chapter 1, maybe it's not chronologically. Maybe it means one day God made something, and another second day God, and then a third day, but it's not like in order chronologically. They try to change it so that chapter 1 is not fixed in stone, because chapter 2 is really the one that's like, we can't change that order. When I saw that, I said, okay, then definitely these are two irreconcilable accounts. I say a lot more, but that's kind of the gist of what I'm saying about this issue here.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good jumping off point. So let me say this. So you mentioned, sorry, let me just read from your book. Just this is on when you start this section, issue number 3. This is paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4. Paragraph 5. It says, informed Bible readers will recall that the chapter and verse divisions we see in our text were not added until the end of the Middle Ages in order to make finding and citing passages easier. And so what I want to do, I guess, is kind of just for the sake of the reading, maybe just, I don't want to say ignore the chapter division, but given that the original, the originals didn't have this chapter and verse division,
right? If
I think it would
put them together.
Yeah, I think it would make a lot of sense to just kind of approach it as, okay, let's look at the whole thing kind of like as a whole. If that makes sense.
Well, let me just say to that point though.
Sure.
Even if you take away, because my point is, that's what Zionist Zevit says about why there's a chapter division there. I add on top of what he's saying, maybe there's a chapter division for a different reason, to draw attention away from the fact that if you saw Genesis 2:4, even without the chapter division, I still think you would see, wait, something happened here. Like it starts again. Because of what you said, there's that Hebrew term toledot, which is these are the generations of. But that's such a stark division anyway. Wait, these are the generations of the heavens and earth? Okay, so we're starting something here, right? I think the chapter division at the end of verse 31, it sort of helps draw attention away from the fact that you're about to get two separate stories here. But even if you didn't look at chapter 2 coming in between verse 31 and verse 1 of chapter 2. Let me say it simpler. even if you didn't break the creation week up to put day 7 in chapter 2, even if you left day 7 with chapter 1, you still would have this total adult. You still would have this, these are the generations, that would cause your eye to say, okay, separate these two accounts. Now, what you do with them when you
Yeah,
separate them is up to you. Whether you say this is just a zoomed in version or what. The total adult, these are the generations of, it does start a new account, or at least a separate account, no matter how you slice it, chapter divisions or not.
I was going to mention that just because to me, like if I was a medieval monk
Mm-hmm.
and I'm the one who's responsible for creating the chapter and verse divisions, I'm thinking the chapter division comes at the end of where it now is chapter 2 verse 3. I
Okay.
would say that's the end of chapter 1. Like
Mm-hmm.
for me, chapter 1 would have 34 verses,
Mm-hmm.
and then starting at chapter 2 1 would be these are the generations of.
Right. You would put day 7 with the other 6 days.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
feel like that just makes the most sense.
Mm-hmm.
Although I guess the traditional rendering is that starting chapter 2 verse 1, this is all the 7th day, which to me doesn't make sense when I read that. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
no, it can't be all the 7th day because there's too much. If you read it
Mm-hmm.
like that, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of it just doesn't make sense. Okay, and I can go into it verse by verse, but yeah, the reading just wouldn't make sense,
Mm-hmm.
which is why I make this, particular. I wanted to read that just to make that clear that I don't
Okay.
consider necessarily the break as it
Mm-hmm.
is in the scriptures to be indicative of everything starting in chapter 2 seems to be one whole day. Um,
Oh, and I don't even know if I've heard that before. I just got what you were saying, as if the 7th day contains everything happening in chapter 2.
yeah,
Huh.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and again, I don't think that's indicated
Right.
in the text, but that could be another explanation for why
Hmm.
that break exists.
Eh,
Then again, I'm speculating.
right.
Yeah, I'm
And the only
speculating.
reason why I think people don't take that route is because even though the chapter division happens after verse 31, there is a much more natural division at verse 4 with these other generations. And
Yeah.
so I've heard some people say, we're still in the 7th day, which means not even just chapter 2, but everything is happening like, in the 7th day. Um,
Oh, okay. I've never
yeah.
heard that.
So that's something similar, but the idea that all of chapter 2 is happening in the 7th day would be interesting, but that these are the generations sort of breaks it up so that you almost don't even need to do that. You kind of just say, okay, well, I guess we're not counting days anymore. Now we're just telling a different aspect of this story.
Yeah, this is a paragraph, two paragraphs after that Zion Zevik quote. You say, notice what we find in Genesis 2,
Mm-hmm.
Genesis chapter 2, even though this is the account of the heavens and the earth, there is no mention of the heavens, only an
Mm-hmm.
already existing earth. This tempts us to think that we must be dealing with the same creation that was previously introduced back in Genesis chapter 1, in which case chapter 2 is simply a more detailed version of that same recently created earth story.
Mm-hmm.
But it cannot be. Um, and you go on to say why it is
Mm-hmm.
not a more detailed account.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is another point of departure in our views.
Okay.
So you still hold that view, right? That this cannot be the
Mm-hmm.
same earth, or this cannot be referring to the same.
Creation account.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's the
And
same Earth because we only have one Earth, but it's not the same account. It's
right.
not. It's
Yeah.
not a detailed version of the same account.
Okay. Yeah. And you mention, you say, first notice that at the beginning of this account there is no greenery in the scenery. Not even the shrubs of the field or plants have sprouted.
Mm-hmm.
So that is in verse 5. Now, the reason I'm going to differ on
Mm-hmm.
that is, so let's maybe go back to the seventh day. So the seventh day, it says this: the heavens and the earth were finished. This is chapter 2, verse 1. Verse 2, it says, on the seventh day, God ended his work and he rested on the seventh day. And then verse 3, and God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. So that ends the 7 days.
Mm-hmm.
Starting in verse 4, and this is the key verse. It says, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. And that line going, and I'm gonna just jump to um same book, which is chapter 5, Genesis
Mm-hmm.
chapter 5, verse 1. It says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he
Mm-hmm.
him. Verse 2, male and female, he created them and blessed them and called their name Adam
Mm-hmm.
in the day where they were created. And then starting on verse 3, it goes on to list the generations.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that this is referring obviously to something that has already
Right.
happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then the same thing in Genesis 9, Genesis 10, verse 1, it says, now these are the generations of the son of Noah, Shem,
Mm-hmm.
Ham, and Japheth, and unto them were sons born after the flood. And then it goes on to list their generations.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that being said, um, Noah had already died by
Mm-hmm.
the time that
Right.
had been talked about. He
So the
died
sons already existed.
Yes. So
Mm-hmm.
when I read that, to me, when I read verse 4, what I interpret that as is this has already happened. The
Yeah.
creation has already happened.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're going to kind of,
Yeah.
how can I say, detail.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I guess I fall into that camp that says
Right.
that this is, but the thing is, and this is where I now my views gets a little more nuanced. I don't necessarily think that this is zooming in
Mm-hmm.
on a particular, like, I think chapter 2 is zooming in, I should say, on a particular location,
Mm-hmm.
where I think Genesis 1 seems to be very general.
The whole earth.
Yes, I think Genesis 2 now, starting from this point,
Mm-hmm.
is here's one here's one, I guess, place,
Yeah.
location, and
Mm-hmm.
we're going to detail what goes down
Mm-hmm.
in that particular place, namely the Garden of Eden, which
Yeah.
hasn't been made yet. But it says in verse 5, now going to verse 5, continuing from that reading of verse 4. Verse 5 says, and every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. To me, this is recalling day 3.
Mm-hmm.
I interpret verse 5 as this is referring to day 3, because day 3, you have the grass, and
Mm-hmm.
you have this is just verse 12, and the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the
Mm-hmm.
tree yielding fruit whose seed was
Yeah.
in itself after his kind. So God makes that, but there's no man yet.
So does he make it in? And this is the question. I agree that the total adults that you named, these are the generations of, right? It's going to tell you about things that already existed in the story. Now we're going to detail, you know, Noah's children, or Adam's children, or whatever. So maybe the total adult in Genesis 2:4 is doing the same thing. Hey, you know that earth I just told you about? Now I'm going to tell you the story about that earth. That's all fine. I'm okay with that. Issues begin to arise when you start looking at, okay, now what are you telling me about this earth? Because what you're telling me about this earth is different than what you told me about the earth before. So like you just said in chapter 1, day 3, is it day 3? Is that when you get plant life in chapter 1?
Yes. Yes.
Genesis chapter 1, you get plant life, right? Before man and without the use of man. You don't need man.
Mhm.
But in Genesis 2, I've had this conversation with several people, so I'll be interested to see how this goes.
Sure.
So 2:5, what comes first in Genesis chapter 2? Man or plants?
It seems to be plants, given verse 5.
how do you get plants there? Because what I'm reading says there are no plants and there are no shrubs. And the reason why there are none is because there's no man. And then,
I'm sorry, you're referring to verse 5?
yes.
Every plant of the field before it was in the earth. Oh, okay, got it. Every plant of the field before. Okay, got it. So this is referring to a time previous.
Mm-hmm. Previously, and they don't get made before the man does.
Correct. Okay, then yeah, then I'm wrong about that. Yeah, then it's not day 3 that it's referring to. Because yeah, you're right. It says before, and every plant of the field before it was in the earth. So that means this has to take place before verse 12. So before the third day. This could also,
Mm-hmm.
because it says, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, so there's no rain. There was not a man to till the ground. Just to get into verse 6, it says, but there went up a mist
Mm-hmm.
from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Now, there was already water. That's clear from verse 2. It says, the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. But that was already with the earth was already here,
Mm-hmm.
and there was already some sort of primordial water.
Mm-hmm.
And so, given that, I think this could be consistent then with anything that happens even before the third day. So this may be recalling something even before. It would
Mm-hmm.
have to actually be referring to something that maybe verse 2, maybe chapter 1 verse 2.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's not even the third day or the first day.
But, and here's the difference though. Here, the earth is not covered with waters. In chapter 1, verse 2,
Yeah.
the waters are everywhere. So much so that they need to be divided by a divider. Dry land can't even appear
Yes, you're right.
because it's
There is
water
no
everywhere.
Okay, yeah, there is no dry land. Yeah, you got me there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then this has yes, okay, so thinking logically about this. So there's so let can you detail the picture for me? So what is
Yeah.
there at this
Yeah.
point?
So at this point, there is land that gets moistened or watered every once in a while by a mist coming up from the earth. No rain coming down on it, no plants anywhere. And there's some people who would say, like you said, this isn't the whole earth, this is just a particular part of earth. But even in this particular part of the earth,
I
the
would say
land,
I would say oh, I'm sorry to cut you off.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say maybe this could be referring to the whole earth. Let's just say for the
Right.
sake of
So people are torn on it. Some people say because of the word is eretz. Eretz could be land, it could be earth, it could be ground. Um,
yeah, I
but
remember that.
yeah, it says no shrub of the field had yet grown up in on the earth. You could localize it to say we're just talking about a part of the earth. But then it says there was no man to cultivate the ground. Okay, if we want to save this from contradicting chapter 1, it's easy to say it's not the whole earth, it's just a part of the earth. That would take care of the issue. But you'd sort of have to, and people do this. I think I cite people who say this. You have to localize this, and you have to make this a seasonal thing. You have to do all these things just so that it doesn't contradict chapter 1.
Yeah, let me not go down that route
Mm,
yet.
okay.
Let me say this. Because you're right, you pointed out inconsistencies in my view. This cannot be referring to even verse 12, because you have the you don't even have the plants yet, but you
Hmm.
do have earth.
Right.
So there's got to be there's got to be at least some sort of land. So
Hmm.
where you could locate it in Genesis 1 is it's got to be somewhere in between verse it's got to be after verse 10 but before verse 11,
Hmm.
because it says, and God called the dry land earth. Okay, I know so
Yeah,
I
it's,
know
it's
I know
difficult
enough.
to do.
No,
Yeah.
listen, I know enough Hebrew
Uh,
to know that there are no capital letters,
hmm.
but the King James authors, for some odd reason, they capitalize the E?
Because their understanding is this is Earth proper. This is the world, not just ground. That's their take on what Earth we're talking
Oh,
about here. Yeah,
okay. I didn't
that's
know
an
that.
interpretive view, but I think it's probably a natural reading that is talking about the Earth, not a patch of Earth.
Right. Okay. So let me just so let me go back and just say that if this is to be consistent with the Genesis 1 account,
Mm-hmm.
it has to be verse 10 after verse 11, because you have seas, you have earth,
Mm-hmm.
and it's before the herbs of the field.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only place I can chronologically put it. I
Yeah.
can't put it anywhere else.
And in chapter one, where do the herbs of the field, where do all the trees, where does that stuff come in chapter one?
That's day 3.
What
That's
verse is
that
that?
same day. That's verse 11, 12, um
Okay, I see why you're putting it there.
specifically verse 12. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is this is probably um talking about day 3 before the
Mm-hmm.
creation of the herbs.
Right. Now, even if that's the case, so this is why it gets more complicated the further down you go. Because
Yeah.
let's say you do that, you put it there
Hmm.
in chapter one, the herbs, the plants, the trees, they come before the man. But here in chapter two, the man's going to come first. And you can't have any of those things because there's no man. And so when you ask me to paint you a picture, I think the picture you're getting here is dry land that gets moistened from this mist that comes up from the earth. It's not just
Yeah.
water everywhere, it's a mist that comes up. But that mist makes the ground malleable like clay. And that clay can be used for making what's needed. A man who could. The problem here is why can't you have shrubs and herbs and plants? Because there's no man to work the ground. Well, how are you going to fix that? Well, there is this mist coming up from the earth, and this mist that wets the ground makes clay. We can make a man, and then that will solve the problem of why we can't have plants. Because now we have a man, then we can make the plants. So this is why I think in chapter 2 you have land, man, then a garden. Then you have greenery because now you have a man who can actually work the ground.
Okay. So we agree on the first part. You said we have land,
Mm-hmm.
and then we have man.
In chapter 2, man is second.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not even second because, like I said, the land is not created in chapter. It's just there.
You know, I follow. I
Mm.
follow everything you're saying, and I don't think we even disagree on
Mm.
anything significant thus far. I don't I think we're in line. We're in lockstep with each other. But let me just say this. Um so given that, going back to verse 4, given that this is
Chapter 1 or chapter 2? Chapter
oh
2.
sorry, no, chapter 2 verse 4.
Mm-hmm.
Given that this is saying, okay, this is let's recall this account of the heavens and the earth,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like this is throwing that, like, let's go back. And so verse 5 is now in my eyes going to verse 10,
Mm-hmm.
for chapter 1 verse 10, saying, all right, here's the earth, no herbs yet,
Mm-hmm.
nothing happening. There is an earth, there is earth, but there's no herbs, there's none of
Mm-hmm.
that. Then there goes up this mist,
Mm-hmm.
and it waters the face of the ground, and you logically connect it to verse 7, where you say this is how God was able to form the man.
Mm-hmm.
I To be honest, if I'm going to be consistent now with this is recalling Genesis 1,
Mm-hmm.
this now is fast forwarding
Mm-hmm.
to day 6.
Right. It would have to.
It would have to. Yeah, it would
Mm-hmm.
have to. There's no other way I can read into that. And is there a is there a contradiction between our views? I don't think there's.
Well, the only contradiction is in chapter 1. the thing
because
that
the
you're
order.
fast forwarding to here, it's still going like is he fast forwarding and then rewinding? Because next he's going to make plants that come after the man in chapter 2, but before the man in chapter 1.
So that's okay. So that's where. So here's what I'll say.
Mhm,
Here's my, I guess, now shedding more light on my view. So if we're to, if I'm to give you a chronological ordering of my of my um of my view, we have verse 5 referring to chapter 1, verse 10.
mhm,
Then we have verse 6 still probably referring to somewhere along that same line. When you get to verse 7, then I say you're fast forwarding to day 6.
Genesis 126 there.
Yeah,
Mhm,
exactly. And then when you get to verse 8, at
mhm,
this point, I would put some sort of, I wouldn't say a chapter break. I wouldn't create a
mhm,
chapter break, but I would create some sort of narrative break
mhm,
that is now referring to something. This, let me to make it very clear.
mhm,
Everything from verse 7 to verse 25
mhm,
is going to be detailing everything in chapter 1, verse 26 to 31.
mhm,
So I'm going to basically say, let's put verse 7
mhm,
until verse 25, and let's put it all in the chapter 1, verse 26 to 31.
mhm. There are problems with that though, and
Okay, sure,
that's what we'll get into
sure.
because depending on what version of the Bible you're reading, and this is what I talk about in the book, you'll see that the things that we're about to read in chapter 2, they happen in a way that are ironclad order-wise, that you can't violate to stick them into chapter 1, verses 26 and, 26 to
Okay,
28.
yeah. Could you
There's a,
elaborate?
yeah. So, um, the biggest thing is we go down to chapter 2, Genesis 2, verse 18.
Hmm.
Right. So in chapter 1, the order is plants, uh, sea life, birds, then animals, land animals, and then man. That's the order. Man and woman. That's the order. But there's
Hmm.
an ironclad order that we're going to get here. It's going to be man, then animals, then ground animals and birds, then woman. And that order is, I think, inviolable here in
Got
chapter
it.
2.
Okay. Yeah. So chapter 1, just to clarify, make sure I have it. We have animals, then man, woman, or man. Yeah, man, woman.
No, yeah. Well, animals, I think is specific. This important to say: sea animals, um,
Oh, yeah.
birds, land animals, man and woman.
Yes, you are right. Yes.
And then 2, it's man, land and air animals, and then woman.
Yes, you are correct.
All right.
Um, so my this okay, so now I have to kind of, if I'm to reconcile this,
Mm,
I would have to say that the reason the ordering is different
mm,
is because now we are in located
mm,
in a specific location.
mm,
So verse 2, let's go back to verse 8. It says, and the Lord God planted a garden
mm,
eastward in Eden. Now, this garden that God plants is not specified anywhere in the opening chapter,
mm,
meaning that this garden is kind of, I don't want to say separate, because it's not obviously separate from his creation, but it's a it's somewhere in this order in Genesis 1,
mm,
but it's not following that. It'd be like this, like if here's God and he's fashioning the earth and he's doing this and he's doing this, and now he creates the garden in verse
Mm,
8, and now in the garden it's like a different ordering. And I agree with you, it is a different ordering. I cannot tell you
mm,
with a straight face it's the same thing. I
mm,
think the ordering is different because now we're moving from the general creation of the whole earth to
mm.
let's detail the creation in this one specific location, namely the garden.
Okay.
Would you
So
accept that, or
I'd have a problem with it unless you can answer this question.
uh-huh
Do any animals exist before chapter 2, verse 18? In chapter 2, are there other animals outside of the garden that exist already?
to be logically consistent, I would have to say yes.
Okay. And I think you're right that you would have to say that. But the problem I would have is chapter 2, verse 18, or verse 19 reads as if this is the initial creation of all the animals. The Lord God formed out of the ground every living animal of the field and every bird of the air. And he brought them to the man to see what he would call them. So this is where the animals get their creation and name from. Um, if I'm forced to reconcile this with chapter 1, then I have to say, yeah, there are other animals outside. But this story seems to be saying, no, this is where they come from. This is where they get their origin and their name. Um, and they're made for a reason, because otherwise, God didn't need to form them. He could have just brought animals from outside the garden. Like, hey, he could have just whistled and had a lion pull up and, you know,
Yeah.
but
um
he's forming them here.
yeah, I see what you're saying. I'm not sure if I read the same. It says out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and brought, so that's clear.
Mm,
In if I'm following my same principles, that in Genesis 1 the animals are created but they have no name.
mm-hmm. They're created before the
um
man, too.
could it be possible, would you be open to the possibility that these are basically the same animals that God has already created, except now Adam is naming them? Or would you say I can't read this any other way than this is
Mm.
the first time the animals are created?
Well, it's possible that we're being told about a second account of, and this is what I say in the book. If the animals have already been created, they're the only thing in this chapter 2 that already exists. Man is created for the first time in chapter 2, even though it's a separate telling. The plant life is being created for a second time in chapter 2, but it's the first time that these plants exist. The animals, we're being told about them again, but now they will be the only things that it's not their origin. In chapter 2, the plants have an origin, man has an origin, but the animals pre-exist, or are they? Is this their origin too? Just like the plant life and man.
Yeah, I would have to, yeah, for the sake of consistency, say that these animals in chapter 2 are not the origin. These are
Mm,
just kind of, God is kind of saying, all right, I
mm.
already made these animals. Now go ahead and name them.
But would you admit? Would you allow or admit? Would you? Do you recognize though that even if he already made them, he is making them again in chapter 2, verse 19?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I
Okay, gotcha,
would.
gotcha.
Because yeah, I couldn't make sense of,
Mm,
you know what's funny? I'll tell you the truth. You might not realize this, but it was you who kind of influenced my reading of Genesis, because
mm,
I remember our very first conversation. You
mm,
told me, you said, I was reading Genesis, and you were saying to yourself, where the heck did Cain get his wife from? Like,
mm.
so I was thinking to myself, when you said that, I laughed. I'm almost certain I laughed because
Mm,
it was funny, but at the same time, I thought to myself, that's a good question, and
mm,
I have to. And again, I don't want to jump further
mm,
ahead, but I would have to say, man, there had to be other humans already.
mm.
They have to come from somewhere because
Right.
unless the Bible is absent that unsaying that Adam and Eve, you know, whatever, like they bore a daughter
Mm,
or something, and then Cain married the daughter.
mm.
Um, but then I believe then once you get to like the descendants, right? Um, like there's like some murder happening, and it's like, well, where did those people come from? I
Yeah.
would just simply say that in Genesis 1:26, there's this. Oh man, I
Mass of
don't know.
human beings.
Yeah, you know what? I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't want to say anything yet. I don't want to say
Yeah.
anything yet.
Yeah.
Maybe we could talk about it later.
Okay. Yeah. I think it'll come back up. It'll come back up
Yeah,
because there
it'll have
are,
to.
yeah, in chapter 6, the the Christian scholars who don't take the literal approach to Genesis 1 and 2, they do have answers that will allow a different group of people in Genesis chapter 1 than in Genesis chapter 2 because they see these problems and they
Yeah,
see that they're insurmountable. So they do something different with them as opposed to try to harmonize them.
yeah. So let's um let me say this. So the
Mm,
order, going back to the order, because the
mhm,
order is important. So we have land in chapter 1, land, plants, animals, man and woman.
mhm.
And then chapter 2, we have land, man, plants. And given my reading, given my reading,
Mm.
wait.
Animals are already somewhere on the scene. They don't come forth, you're saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
I'm trying to map it in my head right
Yeah,
now because
yeah. Hmm.
I'm a little fuzzy. But so I guess just off my reading, we already have the recall to verse chapter 1 verse 10 early
Mm.
on, and then we have day 6, and then the creation of the garden, which I said was just,
Localized.
yeah, it has, that's what I would say, it has to be
Hmm.
localized. Now besides that issue that we've encountered in verse 19,
Mm.
where um yeah, these are, again, just to make it brief, localized animals.
Mm.
They would have to be localized animals of the already existent animals that God has created.
Yeah. I mean, you see, right? Occam's razor here, right? There's this idea of multiplying explanations. You know what I
Occam's
mean?
razor,
Like
yeah.
needlessly or needed. Uh, okay, God's doing it again. Okay, like we have to allow that, but the text seems to. And here's the weird thing. Like people, like Ambassador said this to me, like, and Dr. Michael Brown, said this. Like, what do you think? The author doesn't know that these stories don't go together? Like he's just putting these two contradict. I'm saying I think he knows they don't go together, and I think for whatever reason in their culture they were okay with that. We're not because we need this linear story, but I think they were perfectly okay with these are two different stories that we're going to sew together because they both meet different needs that we have as a culture.
Can I ask you a question, man? And I'm not trying to. I'm not trying to segue. We'll get back
Mm.
into this in a second. But I'm very curious. I would love to see a discussion, like a live discussion between you and Ambassador. Yeah, I knew I was gonna make you laugh.
Well,
But
to be
what?
honest,
Yeah,
like
sure.
like William Lane Craig, remember the video that I don't know if you ever went back and watched the video that I quoted from Craig, but he was talking to this his computational geneticist friend Joshua Swamidass, and Joshua Swamidass had he's a Christian. He had convinced William Lane Craig to pay more attention to what science is saying about genetics and human origins. And one of the things Craig says, I don't think I quoted him on this part, but what he says is, I had never really paid too much attention to Genesis. And so Craig, as an apologist, had to go back and like, wait, what's really happening in the Genesis text here? And very many Christians have had to do that. Ambassador is strong in his theology of the fall. But even when he and I talked about these issues, and I asked him, I said, "Yo, so how do you deal with these issues here?" He had to rely on other Old Testament scholars who had profited. Well, here's how you can get around this. Here's how you get. He was relying on other people to hash out some of these issues, and I didn't press him on it. But I'm like, yo, I spent a good 2 years putting magnifying glasses to these issues, and these suggestions that you're offering about how you get around this and how you get around that. All they do is create other issues. And if you're not going to spend the time to think about them, you really are you're falling behind in where this discussion is going. And so I'm not trying to say anything about or against Ambassador, but I don't even know that I don't know if I would enjoy having a discussion with him about some of these things until he's really put the time in to sift through, okay, if I solve this issue by saying that, then what does it do for this other issue over here? Then what does that do for this issue over here? If you're not going to deal with those things, then to me, you're going to just really be spouting off answers to get you out of trouble right now. You're not really trying to solve all the other problems that come up when you do that. And so, yeah, that sort of was, I got the impression that's where our conversation was going to go. So I just let him cite whoever he was citing, and I left it alone after that. I didn't have any follow-up questions.
Okay, I see. Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. So far, the main issue it seems like we've encountered is that one in verse 19. But yeah, I would have to rely on that being localized. Now, what would be the other? Would there be another big issue?
No, that's really it. That's really it. It's once you recognize that there's a reason why man is made so that plants can exist. There's a reason why animals are made because man is lonely. There's a reason why women are made because the animals didn't do the trick. That violates chapter 1 on all those different fronts. The order violates chapter 1. If you can get around those, then you've got no issue.
Okay, let me say this. Let me I guess throw some as much clarity as I can on my view. So sticking to the Garden of Eden narrative. I've already said that man has already been formed. So let's start from there. I think that's a good point. So verse 7, man is already has been created, right? And now God is going to put this man that he created in chapter 1, verse 26, and he's putting him in this localized location. Once he's in this localized location.
So right now you're saying that this man in Genesis 2:7 is the same man in Genesis 1:26. You're willing to say that?
So here is the weird thing about Genesis 1:26 is that it says, God said, let us make man and let them. And that them is it's implying almost like there's
mankind.
Yeah, like there's many already. So this is, but see, if I'm gonna be honest, Adam has to be the first man. You know,
are you saying that because of Paul, or are you saying that because there are things in chapter 2?
I'm saying it because of Paul. I'm saying
okay. I think there are things in chapter 2 that already suggest he's the first man as well.
Okay. Yeah. No. So I would say that this now he's talking about. Okay, this is Genesis 1:26 is God creates. It's saying that in this universal creation, God creates, all of mankind, men, women, etc. But in this specific, he's taking one localized man in one localized place, and now he's going to the story is detailing this local account. And so you have the garden, right? He puts the man there. That's verse 8. Verse 9. He says, God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life, first time it's mentioned. And that is in accordance with chapter 1, verse 29, where God says, and God said, behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree, to you it shall be for meat. And then there's the river. It details verses 10 to 14 detail what seems to be the geographical location of Eden,
Mm-hmm.
with the rivers.
Mm-hmm.
So then in verse 15, verse 15, it gives the instructions. Verse 15 to 17 gives the instructions for man in the garden regarding, what to do and what not to eat. And then in verse 18, it says, and God said, it's not good for man that man be alone. I will make him an helpmeet for him.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting because I think this is still, so from verses 7 to 18, I think this is still in line with chapter 1, just because if you look at chapter 1, God also creates man first. He doesn't necessarily make men and women together. It says, just reading verse 26, it says, and God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth. Then verse 27 says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. And then it goes on to say, for the first time, male and female.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first mention of female, because up until then, and this is in line, sorry, I know I'm gonna try to really limit my usage of the New Testament, but St. Paul also, to be consistent with Paul, has the same view of Genesis, because he says in 1 Corinthians 11:7, I'll just read it. It says, for a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much as he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. So he's implying, and then it goes on, verse 8, it says, for the man is not of the woman, but the woman is of the man.
Mm-hmm.
Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man.
Mm-hmm.
So Paul is taking this account in Genesis 2, and
Mm-hmm.
he's writing with it. He's saying, yeah, this is a true account of how men were created. Men were created in the image of God. Women were created in the image of man.
Mm-hmm.
And in this verse 27, it says male and female, he created them. But it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't specify how women were created. That is
But it
detailed
does
in
specify
this
that they
book.
were made at the same time, doesn't it?
I would say not necessarily.
Go down to verse 31.
And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. That one.
Yep. The next line.
Oh, and the evening and morning were the sixth day.
So everything that you just read from verse 26 on is one day.
Yeah, that's exactly what I
Mm-hmm.
went back to verse 7,
Mm-hmm.
and I had mentioned that's fast forwarding to day 6.
Right. But I'm saying, but the man and the woman, even when he says he made them, male and female, he made them, that's still happening in the same time frame
The same day.
in chapter
Yes.
1, right?
Yes. Same day.
So
Yeah,
one of
it
the
has
points
to
I bring up in
it
the
has to
book is, and for the person who's watching, there's some people who are watching, like, they might think that this is like so elementary, but I think it's just worth for the person who's a strict literalist.
Mhm.
One of my aims is to kind of pry people's fingers away from literalism, because I think once you do that, you begin to see what's happening here. But so one day, male and female are made. If this is the same creation account that you're reading in chapter 2,
Mhm.
you have all the animals being made and named, and a woman being made in the same day. If it's the same thing that's happening in chapter 1, this all happens in the same day. But that's a lot. Like in chapter 1, you don't get those details. Chapter 1, animals are made, then man is made, and women are made. That's all the same day. In chapter 2, man is there long enough for it to be apparent that he needs help. Then all the animals are made and named. Then a woman is made. Seems a little like, it's one thing to say God miraculously did something. He made all the animals, man and woman, on the same day. God's God, he can do that. Once you bring in the human element of, now you've got to name all these animals in the same day that God creates them and realizes that you need help. these animals don't do the trick. So God needs to make you a woman. Once you add that human element into it, it's almost like, okay, there's no miracle way for a human being to name every single animal, land animal and bird, in one day, and then still have enough time over to make a woman, put her to sleep. And like, it would seem to be, this is a hard thing to fit into the same day and to make it the same story. I mean, that's if you press the story for, reality, for literalness, it just seems to strain credulity.
Let me say this. When it comes down to naming the animals, I would like to know, and I don't know the answer to this, I really don't, but I would like to know how many animals have names in the ancient Hebrew language, because like modern Hebrew will obviously make the new words, but in the ancient Hebrew, how many? Because I mean, I suppose at that point you'd have to get into very minute details as to, okay, they have a name for lion, they have a name for fish, they have, because like, for example, in the story of Jonah, right, you have Jonah was swallowed by a hagadol, right, with like a big fish, hadag hagadol or something like that, right, like a big fish, even though the translations say whale. In Hebrew, it's still fish.
So maybe he just named like, birds, fish.
Yeah, exactly.
Instead of saying this kind of bird, this kind of fish, this kind of, that way it would happen a lot quicker.
Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking of. Because I know in Hebrew, there's like, if I'm not mistaken, the language, the modern English has so many words. Whereas in comparison, I don't think ancient Hebrew has that same depth of lexicon. A lot of the
we wouldn't really know. We would only know about the words that they wrote down and the words that survived. We don't know what didn't survive.
You're right.
But I think so. For me, this all seems much more plausible if what this is what we call etiology. Etiology is just simple stories that explain complex things. How did the animals get their name? Here's a story for that. Why do women have pain in childbirth? Well, here's a story for that. That's how etiology works. We don't go to any other culture and try to press their etiology for truthfulness. We smile politely at some of the etiology and just, oh, that's cute. That, that's what they used to say. But when it comes to the Bible's rendition, because of what the New Testament authors do, we are painted into a corner that now we have to take the etiology seriously. When the case might be that they didn't even take the etiology as serious as we do. But because of the way Paul tells the story, now we have to find ways to make this etiology work.
But this goes back to exactly what you said, and this is why I say I agree with you in your book. If this did not really happen, I mean, we can't make any claim. Like the whole idea of Jesus dying on the cross for the sins of mankind. I mean, if sin is some parable,
Right. And when we get to chapter 9, we're going to actually, I'm going to actually get into that. Chapters 9 and 10, I will actually deal with. That's why I only deal with chapters 1 and 2, Genesis chapter 1 and 2 in the book so far, because these aren't serious issues. I only call this, Genesis chapter 1 and 2, being two different creation accounts. I call them serious issues for taking it literal, not serious issues overall, because there are ways that you can deal with them and just, theologians do things they either harmonize chapter 1 and 2 or they don't harmonize them. They make them one figurative and one literal or whatever. Those are not serious issues. The serious issues come at the end of chapter 2 going into chapter 3, where you start trying to develop a doctrine of sin from what is probably etiology. So, yeah, I mean, everything we've been saying so far for the person who's watching, like I say at the beginning of this chapter, this is the shallow end of the pool. So you're like, why'd you guys spend so many episodes and so many hours on this? Well, because there are some people who want to make this very literal, and I think there are problems with that. But these aren't even the serious issues. We haven't even gotten to the serious issues yet.
Yeah. Um. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Um. Okay, so where we left off was verse 18.
Mm,
Uh. So yeah, we were talking about our disagreement on verse 126 and 127,
mm,
where you say to you it seems like this is happening at the same time.
mm,
Um. The only way I can make sense and to be consistent with Paul's rendering of it
mm.
is if first Paul, I mean, it's almost as if Paul's reading exclusively
Two.
from Genesis 2. Yeah. So
Mm,
I would simply say that if this is, I mean, there's no, I'm not gonna pull something out, a rabbit out of a hat and say, yeah, there were already women.
mm,
So now I think this is the first one. And
mm,
if that's the case, then what is said in Genesis 126, 127,
mm,
um, it seems as if God says, let us make man, and that man is exclusive to
mm,
the male gender. And then in verse 127, it says, God created man in his own image, and again, same thing. And then that it's a semicolon in the King James, but then it says male and female, he
mm,
created them, almost implying like, yeah, but then he made both, you know. Um, and then so this detail in Genesis 2, um, then God is already now to continue my version of events. Verse 19, he's creating. I don't want to say creating for the first time, but he's now bringing to light these animals that he's already created,
mm,
and he's in this localized area and saying, "All right, name these animals."
mm,
And once he names them, then that's when he says, "Okay, none of these are good. So now I'm going to make a woman,"
mm,
and then you get that. Now we're in 127, where he
mm.
creates the woman, and that's the only way I would be able to. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's I guess my full harmony of
yeah,
events.
I get it. I get it. Yeah. If as long as you don't stress things too literally, like if you can have animals before verse 19, and these are just more of the same animals that God's making, then yeah, you don't have an issue there. Um, so yeah, I mean that's one way to do it.
Um, okay, so given that, but let me actually, can I poke back at what you were saying,
Mm-hmm.
namely the etymology. Is that what you said? Etymology, etymology,
Etiology.
etiology. Yeah, I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
mistake that. See, and this is going back to what I was saying earlier. When it comes down to theology, like sometimes you'll throw out words, and I'm like, man, I've never
Mm,
heard that. I've
mm,
never heard that phrase before. Um, but when it comes down to their understanding, like the ancient Hebrews and
mm,
their understanding, there's this phrase, not a phrase, but historians use it. I mean, I've heard historians of ancient Rome
mm,
use this. It's a phrase that they say, we know more about the ancient Romans than the ancient Romans knew about themselves.
mm,
Because the idea is, scholars now are able to go back
mm,
and look at, Roman history, Roman poetry,
mm,
and they have time to sit down for years and
mm,
years and just ponder and do research about this is how the Romans conceived of,
mm,
life, and why they didn't really think about philosophy. The Greeks
mm,
thought a lot about philosophy. The Romans are more practical, so they adopted Stoicism. They're just more
mm,
practical people, and da, 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 da. And maybe a Roman living through that time period at the time wasn't thinking about all that, but we have the luxury of being able to take all of the Roman documents. Okay,
mm,
what am I trying to say with all that? Um, with the Hebrews, I've always felt that the Hebrews are such a unique civilization in the sense that if for example you want to talk about ancient Israelite history or Israelite history in general, and you want to go to primary sources, you really only got pretty much the Bible and what other ancient civilizations were writing about the Hebrews.
Mm,
You know what I mean? But it's not like, because they, everything they compiled other than what's in the Bible is lost.
mm,
You know, and it's kind of, it's really sad. You know, I think the first time I read through the Bible, it hit me how much it's lost. For
mm,
example, um when it talks about a lot of the kings, right? It says, and all of his acts were written in the books of Iddo the seer and
mm.
Gad, and this, and you're like, where are these books? They're lost, you know.
Mm,
Luckily, we have everything else that was compiled
mm,
right in the Bible, but otherwise, a lot of that stuff is lost. And I feel like with other ancient civilizations, we have a lot more
mm,
to be able to, like, if you want to look at, you know, ancient Roman poetry, be like, yeah, let's look at Ovid, you know,
mm,
let's look at all these other, and um or Juvenal or whatever. But when it comes down to the Bible, ancient Hebrew history, it's like you got the Bible
mm,
and then some other primary sources from some other civilizations, but the people of ancient Israel knew themselves the best,
mm,
and all we really got is the Bible. So
mm.
it makes for a very strange kind of, I don't know, it's a very strange, I don't want to say narrow, but
Yeah.
it's very difficult to
Mm,
capture
mm,
probably what they believed, unless you want to lump them in, which I feel like a lot of scholars do, which is they lump
mm,
them in general to ancient Near Eastern civilization that
mm,
encompasses, you know, Assyria, Babylon, like the
mm,
Neo-Babylonians, the Babylonians. Um, I think, for example, if you look at ziggurats, right,
mm,
of like Babylon, that's where a lot of people get their understanding of the Tower of Babel. What is Babel?
mm.
It has to be some sort of ziggurat because
Uh,
they believe that at the top were the gods, right? Like,
mm,
and so, but that's a very, you know, this, it's general,
yeah.
like
Hmm.
in the ancient Near East, this is just how they conceived of this. This is makes, I don't know if I'm making
Yeah. Yeah.
sense.
Well, I think, I wonder what it says about,
Well, I guess what I'm trying to
yeah.
say is it makes it harder
Hmm.
to to gauge how they were thinking. You know what I mean? Like when you,
Yeah.
because going back to what you said earlier, you say it's much easier
Mm,
to read these stories as this is how they conceived
mm,
of, you know, the origin of childbirth.
mm,
And I would say you're right, but but at the same time, it makes it very difficult to, like, you wouldn't, how can I say, um other, like, I think that one's pretty straightforward, the childbirth
mm,
example. But when it comes down to, say, heavens, like
mm,
our, what we were talking about, it makes it very difficult to gather that idea of what is meant by heavens,
mm,
on top of the whole, this is considered to be a sacred history, you know. And since we're dealing with sacred history,
right, right.
it opens up
Mm,
like this, I don't
yeah.
know, maybe I'm just having meta thoughts about the
Well, no, I think
Bible.
that's a good point. I think because of, and this is why I think I like critical scholarship, is because they don't have that sacred view.
Yeah, you're right.
And so they're
You're right.
able to treat it like they treat every other, historical document,
You're right.
and do for it the same thing that they would do. Now they hit the equal sign after they do all that, as opposed to having these pre-commitments where you hit the equal sign before and say, well, it must be divine. Therefore, I've got to reconcile and harmonize and da da da. If you don't have that pre-commitment, you take it as it is, and you make the most sense that you can of what you're being presented with. Um,
You're right. And can I say, can I add
yeah.
a very important thought to that?
Mm-hmm.
Um, one thing that I notice is, if you, for example, um, when people ask, I'll give you my sister. She's probably gonna be watching this, but whatever. I'm gonna use her as an example, anyways. I I've often mentioned to her like, yeah, when I open up and read the Bible in a whole year, I
Mm,
just read it. And she's like, I can't do that. Like, I need to open up my Bible and have, my notes. I need to be
mm,
able to have like the footnotes and
mm,
see like what's going on. I need the context. I need the cultural context. And me, I'm much more,
mm,
if you do that, and
mm,
I've had this discussion with her. I say, if you do that, then I feel like I would never get through the Bible, because just for the sake, you know what I mean? Just for the
mm,
sake of time,
yeah.
I gotta work, you know what I mean? I gotta go to
Mm,
school. I gotta go
mm,
to school in like an hour and a half, right? And be in
mm,
front of my students and teach and grade
mm,
papers. And then I gotta, if I'm gonna do other research, I gotta write on that and read on
mm,
that. I just don't practically have the time
yeah.
to be able to say, okay, today I'm gonna dive into Genesis, whatever, 15, and figure
Mm,
out, let me look at some cross-reference, some, ancient Hebrew scholars. It puts a damper, it puts a
mm,
limit on the amount of time that I have.
yeah.
And luckily, see, that's the beauty about going to seminary, is that
Hmm.
you get to sit down really and just reflect
Yeah.
on these issues almost full time, assuming you're
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
working.
Yeah.
So I think that's a huge luxury to have. And I think that gives you a huge advantage when you come into this conversation is, yeah, I've read the story 10
Mm,
times. I got the
mm,
animals and stuff mapped in my head. Whereas for me, I kind of have to say, okay, I'm gonna go with the superficial reading, but I'm
mm,
not gonna. It gives me, it's an advantage and it's a disadvantage because I'm
right.
consistent, but I don't have the
Yeah. I
extracurriculars.
think it's this idea of being able to see with fresh eyes that you have. You know what I mean? Like, I say this in the forward of the book. Like, what theology does is it labors to straighten out the crooked places in the text. And it's good until you tire of that. One of the things I posted on Facebook today is a book called Old Testament Cosmology and
Old Testament. I think I saw it. Yeah, I think I saw that
Old
post. Yeah.
Testament Cosmology and Divine Accommodation. And the idea of divine accommodation is it's something that theologians use to explain why the Bible can be wrong about ancient cosmology, why it can be wrong about, whatever, was because God was accommodating himself to the level of understanding of the people at that time. And the post that I made on Facebook
Oh,
was,
interesting. Okay.
you know, I said, I would have much less problems with Christian theologians and apologists if they allowed other religions to do the same thing that they're doing with the Bible. You find these things in the text that cannot be literally true, and you bend over backwards to say, oh, well, this was accommodation, and here's how we can still get a truth out of it. Okay. Can you not do that with any other text? And why not? Why this one? And how is it not special pleading? Because you run into these issues, and because of your pre-commitments, you feel inclined to justify it.
Mhm.
But you can do that with any holy book. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
can I add to that?
yeah,
So here's I this is just the way I kind of look at
mm,
it. When I was a skeptic and I
mm,
was looking at, I had the same idea, and I said,
mm,
you know, I can't see why we have to make an exception for this book.
mm,
You know what I mean? Or this compilation of books. Um, and I think one of the reasons is because I already had this idea that all the holy books were false.
mm,
And that was, see that itself is already
mm,
a premise that
mm,
is kind of like the starting point, right? Like,
mm,
since they're all false,
mm,
let's just kind of go through each one and
mm,
show how they're just a product of their time and culture.
mm,
And I think now, coming at it from the other side, my first my first thought is, if this is true,
right.
then it's got to be consistent. And I think it's those two
Yeah.
starting points that clash. Okay,
Hmm.
I'm going to show you how it's not consistent,
Hmm.
because holy books just in general,
Right.
they're products of their time and place, and we're trying to
Hmm.
understand, our place here in this vast universe, and this was
Right.
the best explanation we had. And I
Hmm.
think the other side is one of one of them's got to be true, right?
Right.
Some sort of
Yeah.
logical conclusion you reach that says,
Hmm.
I choose to believe that the truth is here for whatever
Hmm.
reason the person comes to believe, whether it be because they believe the story of Jesus or whatever. But then they say, okay, now, and this is like why apologetics is really a full-time job, because
Hmm.
people are always going to have questions,
Hmm.
and people are always going to come into a book, holy book, whatever it is,
Hmm.
and question it. And that's just the nature of,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, sorry, I don't know,
No,
this
I appreciate
conversation.
that. But see, for me, I'm like, there are people like me who we didn't come to the Bible with, it's just another holy book. They're all false. Let me just show you how. I also didn't necessarily come to it with, it must be true. It explained certain things to me. Why do we die? Why is sin such a problem? Why do I feel guilt? What happens when I die? It provided me with answers that maybe I didn't have the wherewithal to test them, but they seemed true enough in light of what I knew about the world, which was not much. When I
Mhm.
learned more about the world, I ended up saying, well, man, those answers that I accepted so readily, I don't know if they're as true as I thought they were. If they are, then it's going to be consistent. But the more I find the inconsistencies, the more I'm like, well, I'm not trying to come at it with a pre-commitment to truth or falsehood. But because of the correspondence theory of truth, I'm like, I don't know what to do with that other than I feel like that's the best foot forward. So if I find you failing a correspondence theory of truth, and then I find you failing a coherence theory of truth, I hate if it looks like, oh, you were pre-committed to the Bible being wrong. I wasn't. Once you begin failing those truth tests, I don't know what to do with that other than call it what it looks like it is.
Can I ask you a question? Let's just assume. Let's just
Mm-hmm.
assume that we have some sort of individual. I don't know. We'll just make up a person, but let's say we have some sort of individual.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think their natural reaction would be, if they read the Bible this is a crazy question.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I'm hashing this out correctly. But let's just say someone were to read the Bible from start to finish. There, you would say they should be open to understanding this. Either way, it could go either way. They could either believe it's divine, or they could believe it's a product of its time and place. But the more they know about the world, they
Mm-hmm.
should see it as a product of its time and place.
This is somebody that's got no preconditioning, no pre-commitment, just a blank
Exactly.
slate.
Yeah. I know it's a weird example, but
Mm.
I guess what I'm trying to say, Brady, is
Yeah.
I'm actually in agreement with you. I think
Mm.
that yeah, I think that the Bible is one of those. I mean, a lot of these claims in the Bible are just awesome claims, but I mean, I don't mean awesome in like, oh, that's cool. I mean awesome in like the sense of this happened, you know?
Mm. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like God forming, just what we were reading, right? God
Mm.
forming man out of the dust of the ground, and then, next chapter we didn't get into it, but it's, explaining why women feel pain in childbirth. And I think the more
Mm.
straightforward
Mm.
reading is, yeah, this is just how these people conceived of their history, and how they explain the origins of the
Mm.
universe and the cosmos. I think the only way you can look at it the way I'm seeing it, and the way maybe other Christians are seeing it, is if you take that leap.
Mm.
And it's a leap,
Mm.
you have to take a leap of, yeah, this is true,
Mm.
but now how do we reconcile this with the reality as we know it in the
Mm.
21st century,
Yeah.
and given the scholarship in the ancient Near East.
Mhm.
I think in one sense it's much easier to be in the skeptical position because there is no commitment.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. And I think maybe it's difficult for me to answer because, like I said, I think I came to the Bible with I was impressed by the presentation of a God who was eternal, and a God who was not just eternal, but all powerful and responsible for the world, and uh, deigning to tell me about human history. And, that was the battery in my back for 30 years, that this God doesn't lie and cared enough to tell me about himself, to reveal himself. You know, and I could be on the side of this God, and I can read about this God's history when, he invited Israel to be on his side. He was on their side. Yeah, I really don't know how to respond to that other than to say, if I could come to the Bible with a blank slate. Blank slate is hard because I think there's so much you need to know. You know what I mean? You don't know. There's so much that you need to know to make a informed decision about the Bible. If you come to it thinking, oh, one person wrote the first 5 books, so it must not disagree. So that when you see Genesis 1 and 2 seemingly contradicting, would you be inclined to harmonize it if you thought these are different authors, as inclined as you are when you think, oh, it's the same author? So you're inclined because you don't, an author's not going to contradict himself from one chapter to the next. So you begin to work overtime to harmonize it. Yeah, I don't know what blank slate coming to the Bible is like. All I know is,
yeah,
you know what I mean? You come to it with this sense of awe, this sense of God's communicating. So any errors you come across must be in you, not in the text itself. It's hard to think about coming to it as a blank slate. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is a good place to break, man.
So
Yeah,
we can
because
get on chapters 4 and 5 next time.
yeah, let me tell you this because